So now with our code split up, we got now more units, more functions we can test, and therefore I would say that's another great step to do. Now I will say that there are some functions for which we won't write tests yet. For example, in parser.js, there we are using some DOM, some browser APIs like form data, and whilst we can write tests for this as well, this will require some knowledge which we'll gain a little bit later in the course. So we'll ignore this for the moment. We also got some other functions for which I won't write any tests yet. For example, in app.js, form submit handler, which is calling a bunch of other functions, but also, for example, in numbers.js, clean numbers. Because here we are also calling a couple of other functions, and whilst we can write tests for functions that call other functions, this is also a topic to which I'll get back later in the course. All that being said, we also do have a function for which I do want to write a test right now already though. And that would, for example, be the generate result text function. This function does not have any external dependencies, it's not calling any other functions, and therefore I do want to write some tests for this function. Hence, we can add a output.test.js file, and in there, of course, import from vtest and import it and expect, because we'll definitely need that. And then we can write our first test here for generate result text. And actually, since I got two functions here in output.js, I also want to create a test suite that allows me to group those tests, which belong to different units and functions therefore. We won't write any tests for output result yet, because we're also using some browser APIs here, but still, I already want to set up the grouping. Hence, we can also import describe from vtest and actually start by calling describe, pass a string to describe, grab that name of that unit, that function for which we're going to add some tests, and add this here as an identifier. And then in this nested function, we're going to write the actual tests for this function. And then here, the first thing I want to test is the main thing I expect generate result text to do. I expect it to return a string no matter which value is passed in. Because it is called generate result text, and no matter which kind of value I'm feeding in, I expect to get back a string. Hence, here's my test, and I will import from this output.js file here, though we can omit the extension in our vtest files, and I'll import generate result text. And now, as I said, I expect to get back a string no matter which kind of value we're passing in. So I will pass in a value which is a number, let's say, a value which is a string that contains invalid as a text, then maybe a value that's a Boolean. So all kinds of values, I'm arranging those values. And then when acting, I'm calling generate result text with those different values. So here we then got the result 1, and we can repeat this twice to also get the results 2 and 3 for the values 2 and 3. And then my expectation is that result 1 is of type string. And the same should be true for the other results. So I will add those assertions here. Well, and with that, if we now run all our tests again, they all pass, and this new test also passes. Here it is, that's our new test in its new test suite, and it passed successfully. So that was the first new test I wanted to add, but of course I want to add a couple of other tests as well. And I prepared some tests already, which you find attached, which you can paste into that suite, and this will definitely not be all the tests you could write. You will definitely be able to come up with more things you could test. Here I'm just testing different expected values and the respective result texts I expect to get back. In my first test, I expect that I get back a text that contains this number, this result number, which I feed into generate result text. And therefore, I'm using toContain here to check whether the result text I get back contains this number as a string, because that's my expectation if I pass a number to generate result text. Because this function should return text that contains result and then the number as a text if it received a number. So that's what I'm testing here. Then if I pass in a value of no calc, I expect to get back an empty string. That's what I'm testing here. And if I pass a value of invalid, then I expect to get back a string that contains the word invalid, because that is the behavior we have for this function. So these are a couple of other tests I add. You could, as always, definitely add more tests, maybe test for some behaviors you don't want, but I want to keep this fairly simple because this is nothing new. These are just some example tests for this refactored code we have now. But if I do add all those tests I prepared, then when I run them all, they do pass all. So that still works as before, now with more tests for this newly created unit, which we have thanks to our refactoring.